This is the Livestock Session 2 for the Central Dakota Ag Days. I will be your moderator. I'm Sarah Crimmins from the Sheridan County Extension Office, and my assistant Jeff can introduce himself.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Stockler. I am the Griggs County Extension Agent, and I just started here in September. Welcome everybody to the meeting today.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So I am going to share my screen. Let's get started with session 2 for the panel discussion. The format will be, we have about 50 minutes, and we will have each speaker introduce themselves, give a brief synopsis on the subject area that they had gave their presentation on earlier. So we'll get through all the speakers, then we'll open it up to questions and answers. If you have a question, please submit them in the chat box, and Jeff will help get those asked to the presenter. And at the end, we will have a program evaluation, and that will be posted in the chat box at the end of the discussion. The panel presenters for this session 2 is Kendall Swanson, Kevin Sevick, Karl Hoppy, and Tim Becker. So I will unshare, and we will have Kendall introduce himself first.
I'm Kendall Swanson, a professor at NDSU in Fargo, and I have a teaching and research appointment. My research focuses on beef cattle nutrition. The talk I gave was on the North Dakota Beef and Sheep Report, and this is basically a summary of kind of a cross-section of research done across the state in beef cattle and sheep. And I've kind of coordinated that for the last several years, and it's fun for me to do because it's kind of lets me see the breadth of work that people are doing. Also, I think it's good for us to get our information out there. So I just kind of, in my talk, I showed where you can find that. I gave some highlights of this last year's report that came out in September. And yeah, I just appreciate the opportunity to share this, and hopefully some more people look at it every year. So thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. Can we hear from Kevin now?
Well, good afternoon. I'm Kevin Sevick. I'm the Extension Rangeland Management Specialist and Professor in the School of Natural Resource Sciences and the Director for Central Grasslands Research Extension Center. And my topic today was which annual forages are best. And this is a loaded question because it's a big question. And I designed the presentation around helping producers decide with all these options, which ones fit them best. When will they be harvesting their hay type, and then select based on that timing period. Also, do they have the availability to grind their hay or not grind their hay? Because some forages are better as a ground hay than they are as fed as is. And so I designed it to let them ask those certain questions up front, and then it kind of dwindles down those options that they're going to look at, and then they can pick based on that. Costs play a role as well, and I didn't get into costs at all. And also soils play a role. So there's just different options to look at, but it gives them an opportunity to at least think about what they're going to do with that hay, when they're going to harvest it, how they want to use it, and then pick from those lists. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, Karl.
Hey, welcome to the Central Dakota Ag Day. My name is Karl Hoppy. I'm the Extension Livestock Specialist located here at the Carrington Research Extension Center. The topic I was given was to talk about corn silage, and let me just summarize it up by saying corn silage starts with healthy corn plants. All too often we get poor yields and poor production because we're taking the poor fields to plant the corn silage rather than the good productive fields to plant. And healthy fields, healthy soils lead to a healthy plant with a lot of tonnage per acre. And when you get tonnage, that's when the cost per ton of corn silage gets to be really competitive for feeding livestock or beef cattle or their calves. One of the things we follow in North Dakota is putting up corn silage at its proper moisture content. It should be 65%, 2/3 water, 1/3 dry, but it's amazing how many piles get to be less than that, where they're chopped after frozen, or there's other issues that show up. There's always a discussion of using inoculants on soy and corn silage piles. If you use them, it gets that silage pile kick-started in the right direction for fermentation. Seems nobody in North Dakota likes to cover silage piles except for people that put up silage in the summertime and dairies. And if you're really serious about raising corn silage, for a few $100s worth of plastic, you could save thousands of dollars worth of feed spoilage in a silage pile. I like the idea of taking a temperature on a silage pile, just to let you know what the status of your silage pile is. A long 3-foot long thermometer stuck in the pile will tell you if how soon it starts to heat, when it starts to cool off, and how good of a job you did packing, as well as excluding the air from getting into the pile. And one last thing, when it comes to feeding silage, try to keep a fresh face on the silage pile. So you're always feeding good, fresh silage that's got a odoriferous smell that cattle like to come after. So want to talk more about corn silage, let's visit.
Thank you, Karl. And now we'll hear from Tim.
Hi, I'm Tim Becker. I guess I'm on as the producer that's using cover crops. We planted quite a bit of cover crops this summer due to a lot of acres of preventive plant in the spring. Unfortunately, we're extremely dry right now, but it's awful nice having those cover crops late summer this fall to graze on. At the time the video that Chandy and I put together was taken, they were on the field 1. And unfortunately, about a month ago, we had a fire that jumped a highway down here and burnt out pretty much all the grazing on that section. And about a couple miles of fence. So now we've got them. Actually, last Saturday, we moved the cows into the second field that we did some video in, and they got turned there on Saturday, and there's roughly 200, probably closer to 225 head grazing on that right now. They seem pretty content. They only come home for water. They can travel throughout the whole section, but there's about 15 to 20 acres there, and they seem to be pretty content out there. That mixture in that field was a mixture of quite a mixture of kind of whatever we had left in the shed. There was barley, radish, oats, kale, turnips, peas, and probably some lentils mixed in. That was planted on 7-inch rows or 15-inch rows, and in between we planted grazing corn in with that. And then there was probably some millet and sorghum sudan still left in the drill from earlier seeding during the summer. Fortunately, the grazing corn didn't do real well. We seeded it all through the same, out of the same tank, or I should say the same setting up through the same gang, and it got seeded a little bit shallow. And so the grazing corn came up kind of thin. It was out there, but I don't think it had enough moisture to germinate quite right, since we've been so dry this summer and this fall. But yet we had a pretty good stand out there. We did graze, I should say swath, probably a little over half the field. Intent was to do swath grazing on it, and left the other half standing, just thinking that they would probably feed it up better in a swath than they would standing, more trampling. But it's funny, the week that they've been out there, they seem to be in the part that's standing. I think we've had another field that we had them on that was swath, and they cleaned it all up. But cows seem to like to graze better than they like eating stuff from a swath. So they started out in the standing cover crop, and I think they'll go to the swaths when that gets cleaned up. Other than that, I guess that was what my presentation was on.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, and other presenters, now we will open it up for some question and answers. I can get us started. Who was the first one? It was Kevin. So when you're looking at the different forages, is there ones that you say are safer as far as the nitrates toxicity, or ones that you should shy away from because they're more risky with the nitrates, or what would you tell a producer?
So when it comes to nitrates, my first question I ask producers is, did they fertilize the previous stand, or did they fertilize that crop? And if they did, there are certain forages that tend to accumulate nitrogen more than others. Oats is by far your most common one that you look at. And so I would stay away from oats first. The other ones don't seem to be quite as high, but any of them can really accumulate nitrates. But no, oats is the big one. So when it comes to planting forages, I basically tell them to use a starter fertilizer, so they allow you to actually use that nitrogen up to produce the forage. And if they do that, using nitrates are not an issue unless you have drought conditions or stress conditions where nitrates can accumulate. And so the warm season crops tend to be safe for nitrogen. nitrates, and then your cool seasons, especially the forage barley seems to be safe. We tested some forage barley this year, seemed to be low. Oats were the highest, and the ones we tested, and triticale was actually second highest.
Sarah, we have a question that's come in for Tim. Was that Jeff Gale is asking this question. He said he was in the field before you planted the cover crop, and about when did you plant? And it's been so dry, how much growth did you get?
It's been extremely dry, and we got actually quite a bit of growth because both of these fields were extremely wet. It's low ground where we planted. So even though we've probably only gotten about 5 inches of rain all summer, we could still get stuck in these fields at the day we planted them. So we got pretty good growth on them. They were planted somewhere around mid-July, somewhere between mid and the end of July. That's just when we could get into these fields. So they got pretty good growth on it. Most of it was probably hip high.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have one that came in for Kendall. What research project in the beef report was a substantial impact for the beef industry?
Now that's a good question. It's a real broad group of projects. So I don't know, I think there was some real good work on water quality and in pasture situations and like ponds. Also, that would have some direct influence. Some of the substantial things maybe were a little bit more not quite yet there for getting results out there that can be used, but a lot of things related to fetal development and developmental programming, that there's a pretty big strength across the state in that type of research, and we're making some progress on that type of work. So one of the, I guess, approaches I have is I encourage everybody to submit, and I think it's important that there's some information in there that's a little bit further away from the producer, but some of these things could become real big breakthroughs in the future. If we think some of the technologies that we use now, they would never be there if we wouldn't have done research on those. So I think it's important for people across the state to see kind of that breadth of research.
All right, Sarah, there's been another question come in, and I'd say this is for Kevin and Tim both. Would you put in cover crops for grazing if you did not need to for prevent plant? And how long into the fall or winter do you graze cover crops?
You want it first, Kevin, or should I go?
You can go first.
Yes, I would put them in for if I didn't have cows to graze on, because I'm a no-tiller and I'm looking for the soil health. But if I didn't have preventive plant, every year we plant cover crops for this purpose, for grazing. So we take some cropland for the sole purpose of raising annual forages and cover crops. I don't know if that answered both parts of the question or not.
And I would concur with Tim. I mean, cover crops have a role in terms of soil health and microbial enhancement within the soil profile. PP acres are a great way to use cover crops, but that's just happened in 2020. We've always looked at cover crops as an option. And if you can use it into an integrated livestock cropping system, it's almost always economically beneficial to do it, unless you have drought conditions like 2020. Where production would tend to be low, then it comes to not being quite as cost effective, especially in that given year. But I tell producers, if they're going to get involved in cover crops, which we recommend they do, is not a one-year opportunity. It's a long-term commitment that you're doing to improve your soil health. And I don't care what kind of soils you're looking at, cover crops can do that if you look at the long-term benefits within your cropping systems.
I think, the other part of the question was how late could we go grazing these? It depends on how many cows you got and how many acres you got. But, with the weather the way it is right now, I love this not having snow. if I could, I'd keep the cows out all winter and wouldn't ever start the tractor to feed a bale. So, that was the reason we put ours on a swath. Was the goal was if we did get locked into snow early, which we haven't, thankfully, the goal was to try to get them out there, with some snow on the ground and keep them grazing and not have to be out feeding them yet.
Okay, Tim, so to tie into that, we had another question. In your experience, how many cows can you put on an acre for how long? For like example, 10 cows on 1 acre for 4 days, or what do you see with when you use a cover crop?
Kevin probably can hit this one better than I can, but right now I've turned them into this 15 to 20 acres. There's probably 200 to 225 animals out there. Half of them are we haven't weaned yet, so the calves are out on the cows yet. Turned them in last Saturday on that 15 acres. Boy, they haven't hit it hard yet. There's going to be, I'm hoping you get another week plus out of it. Just, gauging it. I guess we graze it until it's gone, but I guess I don't have a real good feel as far as how many acres I'm going to get on it. Kevin might be able to handle that one a little bit better than me.
Yeah, and that's a tough question because obviously moisture drives production. Production will drive animal numbers. And so year in and year out, it's going to be variable. The biggest caveat I talk about, and Tim kind of covered it, is stock density. If you can kind of crowd those animals into a smaller area, your efficiency goes up and the amount of waste or I shouldn't say waste, but trampling goes down. And so keeping a stock density of at least 1 to 1 acre per cow. I like to go more in the, like Tim, I like to get between 5 and 10 cows per acre to improve my efficiency of harvest. And that makes it more cost effective. If that makes sense.
I've always said I've been a real believer in if you got cropland and you got cows, you should have a fence around everything you own that has water on it. I think we're missing a big resource here, and if you can graze cows out there, and the big factor is, and I never really realized it when I was working for Extension, until you come home and start looking at the cows, but there's lots of energy out there, even in this aftermath, but what's missing is protein. And so we've got protein tubs out. We've done the nut ball where, you do test manure, and that's always been the factor when we get them out in this late season cover crop, especially there's no green left out there. But this stuff, some of it was swath, and what's in the swath has got some pretty good green to it yet. But these cows will lose weight real fast. We had nut ball samples in pastures that have come back with cows losing anywhere from 1.5 pounds to 2.5 pounds a day if you don't have protein out there. So, if you're going to do cover crops, especially this late after a frost, you got to have a protein source out there. There's lots of energy. They just need protein.
We saw the same thing on our cover crops that we did on demonstrations. We had the early freeze on September 7th, which took all our warm seasons cured out, and protein was the limiting factor. Our cows with calves on their side at Fargo actually lost 1.5 pounds a day in that month of September and October. So you're absolutely correct. And every year is different. When you get that freeze will drive protein value, and know that if you have a calf on their side, you need to provide some supplement, and it's protein, not energy.
Okay, this question is for Mr. Karl. So, like with the early frost this year with the corn silage, I'm assuming that when it frosts early, it will affect the silage yield or not?
If you had a long season variety corn silage that would have kept growing for another month, if we would have had a late October, obviously we would have lost yield. But if you got a short duration corn silage, or if you're doing grain corn that has a quick dry down, shorter day length corns, then I don't think the short early frost would have really created much of a quality loss. Now, sometimes we ask the question about quality of corn silage because it doesn't have enough grain in it, but sometimes there's quite a bit of sugars in the stalk before it's froze. So total, when you start testing the TDN value of the silage piles, they, rather than being 66% TD or 70% TDN, they might be 66 or 65% TDN. So it appears maybe the quality really hasn't dropped that much, although that shows that quality has dropped some just because of an early frost.
So with that being said, do you have a variety of corn that you recommend for producers in our area that seems to do better, or that you don't recommend?
Well, we got to go to our agronomist for that question. I like to talk about it once it's been chopped for silage. or chopped for feed. So long day length, short day length, grain corn varieties, forage or silage corn varieties. It appears everybody's got their own issue of what they like to have. My own personal perspective is forage, long season, silage blend varieties, silage type varieties, extra leafy, brown midrib, those types of things tend to produce more moisture and more silage and hang on to their moisture longer into the season. We don't necessarily want quick dry down in corn silage in North Dakota. We'd rather put it up wet.
Do we have any other questions? What about on the corn silage that you don't run out of it you have plenty of it. So does the corn silage pile go bad, say come late spring into the summer, or do you want that fed up sooner than later?
If we would cover our corn silage piles with plastic as soon as it's been harvested, we can keep that stuff a year, 2 years, 3 years. Doesn't appear to be that much of a problem once it's ensiled and pickled appropriately. If it's been dry harvested, in other words, less than that 66% moisture or somewhere less, those piles may not pack hard enough. They may not produce enough acid and pickle themselves, what I call it. They may not have good storage. That's why a thermometer is good. If you stick a thermometer in some of these piles and they're still heating right now, that indicates that you probably didn't get good fermentation going on and never went to a low enough pH to arrest the growth of the microbes. So with that, a lot of guys won't cover their silage piles this time of the year. And when it comes to next spring, there's going to be quite a bit of waste on top of the pile. And if they try to hold it over for the summer, there's going to be 2 or 3 times as much waste. So that 1 foot or 6 inches of waste will turn into 2, 3, or 4 feet of waste on top of a silage pile if it's not been covered. So carrying over silage from this year to next year is usually not a good idea unless it's been covered. And as soon as the weather warms up, it tends to dry out and go out of condition. So yeah, I wouldn't encourage holding it over unless it's been covered. But if it's been covered, the feed quality remains pretty much the same next year too.
I was going to jump in, Karl. You know, we harvested silage in 2018 and we took 2 years of crop that year. And so we tarp ours and we tarped it. It cost us about $900 to tarp it. We are still feeding part of that 2018 silage this year in 2020. It's about maybe 8 to 10 inches of spoilage on the top. Otherwise, it looks the same. Quality was the same when we tested it. So if you're willing to tarp it, it'll stay over if you make good silage. But what tarping is critical.
I was going to ask, what type of tarp did you use? Did you use an oxygen limiting membrane as well as a plastic cover, or a 2-ply tarp, or was it a single-ply black plastic type tarp?
We used a single-ply black tarp. It was, it might have been double-ply, but it was because it was white in the end. That's really all it took.
You know, some plastics will keep water out or minimize the amount of water that will run through. Other plastics will limit the amount of oxygen that moves through the pile. That's why there's talk of using 2-ply or membranes over silage piles so you don't get oxygen into your pile. That's why I wonder why you had a foot of spoilage is perhaps there was oxygen migration through the tarp in the pile.
Yeah, it might have been not a good enough, but it was about 8 to 10 inches, yeah, that we had.
But on the other hand, probably when you put it up, you didn't think you're going to be feeding it for 2 years or 3 years.
Not 3 years.
Have you tested the quality of the silage this year compared to what it was 3 years ago? Has it maintained itself?
We did not test it this year. We did test it last year, and it maintained itself for 2018 and 2019. We only had about enough for about a month left for this year, so we didn't test it. But it still looked really good. It smelled good.
I assume it was a good wet silage when it was put in the pile too.
Correct. Yeah, it was put up around 68%, 67%.
This year with the early frost, there's a lot of silage piles that have a nice brown color that were chopped a month after it froze, if not longer. And I'm surprised how most of them are still 65% moisture, but they don't have that great smell of good green, fresh silage. They don't have the good look of good green, and they're still heating somewhat too in these piles. Although I do find it interesting that places up like Park River, They never did get a frost. Places up near the Canadian border, only half the plant froze. And here around Carrington, the whole plant died. So you'd think as you go further north to Canada, there would have been more frost damage than, than here. Not the case.
Okay, Kendall, so when you are doing these research projects, is it all NDSU campus or research center research done, or do you go to local producers? And how long do your research studies usually go on for?
Yeah, good question. So the research is from both here in Fargo and also the research extension centers. And also this year, we also did some work with the USDA folks in Mandan. So they were on one of the papers in there as well. Some of the work was also done on, I think the water things I talked about were done on ranches across the state. So yeah, basically a lot of different places. There's been past reports on corn silage quality or ditch hay quality across the state, or reproduction type synchronization experiments and things on producers' operations as well. I guess the length of the studies, it could range from a pretty big range of things that could be a month of time or maybe even years for the study. So it just depends on that specific study. So yeah.
Tim, on average, well, I guess what would you say your average cost to seed in a cover crop would be on like your most common mix you use?
Typically, I've always been a belief keep it cheap. We try to use what we have. Of course, there's always things that I have to buy. For most people, the peas are the expensive part. We raise field peas, so I've got them in the bin. So most of what we plant as cover crops are something that I have on the farm in the bin already. And that's what we utilize. You know, of course, if we do millets or sorghum sedans, we have to purchase those. The grazing corn I had to purchase. But, you know, my goal is to try to keep it under $10 with bin run stuff as much as I can. But, you know, I don't think it's anything to be, you know, double that on cover crops per acre.
Question just came in for Tim here. Are you giving serious consideration to the wide row corn? Why or why not?
I had only about 5-8 acres of it in this year for a trial at the farm. We planted the cover crops into the wide row corn. I seeded it with my row crop planter, 8-row row crop planter. So it was fun trying to get the population high enough, and it was kind of a battle, but not that big a deal. But we put cover crops down the middle. We came in after the corn popped out of the ground and seeded the cover crops into the standing corn, and it seemed to work as long as the corn wasn't real tall. Where it was a little bit taller, I had some that was probably in the 4-collar stage, 3 to 4 collar stage, and boy, we just beat the snot out of that corn. It was into our corn silage. That was on 30-inch rows, and it beat the snot out of it, but it seemed to come back. But for some reason, we did not have luck with our cover crops coming up into our 60-inch row corn. I don't know if it was a chemical carryover issue or what it was, but basically we had nothing come up. And the day we left that field, we went into another field and seeded the same cover crop, and it came up beautifully. But there was nothing that came up in that 60-inch row corn for us. And I don't know why. It had to be an issue with as dry as we were, if it was that, or if it was a chemical issue. But when it came to yield and harvesting the 60-inch row corn, our corn did not run well at all this year. The plants were there, but just didn't have much of a cob because of the drought. It didn't seem to really run a lot different. It was less than our 30-inch row corn, but it wasn't significantly less. So would I try 16-inch row corn again and cover crops? Yes. I'm not going to blow it off because the things didn't work well the first year. We'll try it again next year. I think there's a lot of opportunity there and promise there if you can just get the system to work. Try again, I guess.
All right. Another question that came in: if we fly on cover crops, what crops work best? That is flying into corn.
Nothing.
Well, I'll jump in there right away. I mean, in terms of flying in a cover crop, the most common one used is the winter rye or winter cereals. And if you do a winter cereal, you're looking at rye, your most economic one. It's also easier to establish. Most cases or many cases fail, and it's usually a function of water. Getting the seed to soil contact becomes a limiting factor. And so you have to get the good timing of moisture to get that seed to soil contact to get germination. And so rye is probably your least risky. And some producers will add a brassica with that rye, whether it's a radish or a turnip. And those give the most cost-effective opportunities to do it in corn, what I've seen anyway. But many of them fail because of the poor seed to soil contact.
I can throw in a couple cents here too. I didn't fly it on this year, but I broadcasted through a 70-foot irrigator that we had here. I did about 30 acres, and that was oats, turnips, radish. I can't remember what else. The small seeded stuff came up a lot better than the oats did. I think it's an issue of, seed to soil contact, like Kevin said. The low areas, we got a pretty heavy rain right after that in the end of July, and all the low areas came up really well. The high areas were thin, but what did come up in the high areas was not the oats. It was the turnips and radishes. But through the low areas where it had water and rain on top of it, and probably some movement of, some trash for that heavy rain to cover it up, it came up beautifully in that area. But that
What time of the year and how tall was the corn, Tim?
No, that went into some PP ground.
Oh, okay.
That we could, it was still too wet that we thought take the drill out there, but the big tires on the irrigator, we thought we could, the big three-wheeled
Sure.
thing, we thought we could cover or carry on with that. And that's what I went out there with. And I would have done the whole 100 acres, but I had a mechanical issue and I broke down. But the 30 acres I got done came up really well in the low areas, which was the majority of what I covered.
And when did you do those?
That would have been mid to late, probably, it was before the end of July, probably around the 15th, 20th of July. And I got a pretty good stand in the low areas. And we grazed that out. And that's the stuff that burnt off. And I think it was where the first video was. And the cows, we had the cows out there too long. And they grazed it down to nothing. There was nothing left and we pulled them off of there. It was enough to burn, but it wasn't enough to graze on. So.
There was another question for Tim on the chat. Do you vary your cover crop mixes each year? And if so, what are the reasons for your mixes you choose?
I don't think from year to year we vary a lot. We're always looking at trying to get a broad, I'm using the drill to put it on. We always want a legume in there, which we have the peas available. We've got oats available, so there's always oats in the mix. And then I always try to get a turnip and a radish in there. And like most producers, when you get done with the spring of the year, you got to empty out the drill that's maybe got some treated seeds. So we got the half bag of this or a half tote of this that's been, cleaned out the drill, and open bag of this, and a little bit of corn that cleaned out the drill. We just start dumping that in. It's a good way to get rid of that treated seed. And so that all goes into our cover crop mix. But from year to year, that does change. But every year I try to get a legume in there, something small seeded like a turnip, radish, or kale, maybe all three. And I don't think you need a high percentage of those. We usually try to put about a pound of each per acre of the small seeded stuff. And then oats kind of makes up the rest of the mix, or a barley or a wheat or whatever you have. So typically year to year, that's kind of what our mixes are for cover crops. And if we get a lot of growth in a good wet year, we may go out and hay some of that. If not, we're going to graze it or put it in a swath. Of course, from year to year, we always put millet and sorghum sudanine. We've done that for years, and we typically try to hay that, but some of that usually ends up in the mix too.
Thank you, Tim. Karl, do you have a feedlot school coming up for 2021?
Interesting. Yes, we do. And it's held on January 20 through 21st of 2021. So please call the office, visit with Linda Schuster, put your name on the registration list. We're going to do something different this year because of the restrictions on we're cutting the class size in half. So rather than having 30 operations, we'll be down around 15 operations. But with that, we'll be able to provide some social distancing amongst the class. And yes, we're going to have it January 20th to 21st of 2021.
Will you have a virtual option or just face-to-face?
No, we really need to go down the livestock unit, look at cattle in the on feed, look at the feed bunks. So with that, it will be live, not virtual.
Okay. Let's see here.
And please put your register, if people are interested, please have them call right away because we have a waiting list that can fill up our school this year already. So.
Kevin, so with our current situation of the drought, is there a certain forage that might do better with the drought-like conditions that producers could look at using next year?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I just did a talk on Tuesday on managing with the drought conditions or looking for 2021. And I was shocked how dry the state actually is, especially the Northwest has only received 15% of its normal precip in the fall. And the Carrington Street or Minot area is about 50% at best. So when you look at forage types that do better under drier conditions, we actually tested triticale, oats, and barley in 2020 in dry conditions. And our best performing spring cereal was actually barley versus the oats and triticale. So in dry conditions, you may want to look at the barley because it seemed to do a little better in the drier conditions. When you look at the warm season crops, millet tends to be the best one to pick from on dry conditions. And if I'm looking at a variety under dry conditions, I look at Siberian millet versus the German millet. German takes a lot more water up than Siberian. So I would look at Siberian millet and probably a forage barley to start with if conditions continue to stay dry.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions to ask our presenters?
Kevin, I was wondering, this may be an impossible question to answer, but tell me about how pastures recover after a year or two drought or a dry period. Let's say next year in the spring, moisture's normal. Well, do we have normal pasture growth, or does it take them a year to regain their strength and recover?
If you look at the conditions that we've seen the last 2 years, the difference between 2021 compared to 2020 is we came in this year in 2020 with a lot of subsoil moisture. It was extremely wet last fall. In fact, much of the state was at 150 to 250% of normal precip in the fall of 2019. And so that saved us this year in terms of pasture growth and pasture development. Now, we're also seeing pastures being overgrazed this year because of the dry conditions. So the caveat is that for 2021 in particular, if your pastures were stressed in 2020, primarily due to grazing pressure, you're going to see a loss of production in 2021, irrelevant if we have adequate or excess moisture. That's a function of stress and vigor from the plant. And so if your pastures were not overgrazed this year, we get normal precip in 2021, pasture growth should not be affected. So it really comes down to how you manage those pastures that occurred in the fall of 2020 that drives it. Our bottom leaf that grows in the fall is the first leaf that grows in the spring. So if you remove that leaf tissue, you'll see a delay of 2 to 3 weeks in 2021. And that in itself makes up about 20% of its growth because of that delay in growth. Does that help, Jeff?
Kevin, will those plants put on that bottom leaf in the fall if there's not enough moisture to do it?
That's another good question. And the answer is no. if it was removed during the growing season, you know, that July, August, and you didn't get any regrowth, you didn't get that tiller development that's your first growth in the spring, that has to now occur next spring. And so you'll see the same effect if it didn't have it in the fall. The other caveat is because of the stress, normal plants will normally produce 4 to 5 tillers. During drought conditions in the fall, those tillers die. And if you lose all of those tillers in the fall because of drought or because of winter conditions, because we're open, that we're seeing right now, it has to start from scratch again in 2021. So the nice areas that will actually recover well are those areas that were deferred in the fall, weren't grazed in the fall, had that green tissue growth, or they weren't used at all. Those ones won't be impacted because they have that tiller there.
So here is the contact information for our panel members, Kendall, Kevin, Karl. Tim, I'm not sure how, if anyone has questions, how you would like them to contact you.
I can get hold of Chandy. She can get a hold of me, I guess. I mean, they can call me or email me.
Okay, so there's that. And Jeff put the evaluation link in the chat box. And remember, you only have to do it once for the whole day. And we are the final session of the day. We'd like to thank our sponsors that helped make the Central Dakota Ag Days a success. The North Dakota Corn Utilization Council, the North Dakota Soybean Council, the NCR SARE program, and multiple crop improvement associations, and Eddie, Foster, Greg, Sheridan, Stutzman, and Wells County, and all of our great crew members planning the Central Dakota Ag Days. Thank you to all of them. Thanks again to all the presenters in this session and the session one. It was great being a livestock guru myself. So thank you, everyone.